Mark chapter 7, let's start reading verse number 24. Mark chapter 7, verse 24, and it says, "And from thence he arose, and he went into the borders of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered into an house, and would have no man know it, but he could not be hid. For a certain woman, whose young daughter had an unclean spirit, heard of him, and came and fell at his feet. And the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nation, and she besought him that he would cast forth the devil out of her daughter. But Jesus said unto her, Let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it under the dogs. And she answered and said unto him, Yes, Lord, yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. And he said unto her, For this saying, Go thy way, the devil is gone out of thy daughter. And when she was come to her house, she found the devil gone out, and her daughter laid upon the bed." We'll stop there. Now, when we left off several weeks ago, Jesus was kind of scoring the Pharisees on morality, and they were, just from a geographical standpoint, around the Sea of Galilee. And so by this point, where we are in the book of Mark, Jesus is well into his earthly ministry. He's been in Galilee for over a year, and we understand that the converts really have been a few from a number standpoint. He has large followings. But as far as those who literally believe on him as the Son of God and the Savior, they are few. And from this point, he travels north up into the Gentile area known as Phoenicia, which is in what we would know today as modern-day Lebanon. Now, this would have been a very long trip. As I said, he started from somewhere around the Sea of Galilee on the northwestern side. But from there, Tyre, the city of Tyre, was about 35 miles from that western side of the Sea of Galilee. And then from there, Sidon was another 20 miles from Tyre. Now, from Sidon, as we go through the book of Mark, we'll see that Jesus went through the mountains of today of Lebanon into the area of Decapolis, which is where he met the demoniac there, into the area of Decapolis, which was on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And so he kind of makes this large circle in this trip up into Phoenicia and down back into Galilee. Now, people estimate that this trip would have taken, depending on the exact route that he took and the mountainous way that he went, roughly between 120 to 150 miles to do this entire trip. Now, what is interesting is when you read through the book of Mark, we don't really know much about what happens on this trip. We have this story that we read, one more we'll see at the end of chapter 7, and then one event in chapter 8. And that's all we get from this trip that would have taken quite a while. And so we don't know all the things that happened for a trip that would have lasted at the quickest several weeks, and more likely probably several months. And so from that, we kind of estimate why it is that Jesus went and he did this particular trip. And so we know that Galilee, as we've talked about, that Galilee and really Israel as a whole has largely rejected him as their Messiah. And so this could simply be seen as a judgment against Galilee and a judgment against Israel. If you don't want your Messiah here, then the Messiah is going to go up north into the Gentile area. However, this long trip would also serve as ample opportunity for him to teach and inform and instruct and disciple these 12 who have been following him now. Now, you got to understand, it's not too long now from the cross. And so Jesus knows that his time here on earth is rapidly coming to an end. And so the time that he has with his disciples is really precious for this time to teach and to train and to get them ready to go out and to be prepared to do the things that they're going to have to do, that we read in the book of Acts. And so in my opinion, I think that's really what this trip was about. It was a way for him to get away from the area of Galilee, from these Jews that he's just constantly butting heads with, and a time for him to get away and spend some time with his disciples. We read there in verse 24 that he goes into this house and he would not have any man know it. He wants some time alone, some private time with his disciples, but as is the case with almost everywhere Jesus went, that's not what happened. And so this was just a chance for him to disciple the disciples. That's really what I believe that this trip was. But then we see verse 25, but this woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit, she heard of him. She came and she fell at his feet. And so as he would have no man know it, I love what it says there, He could not be hid. He could not be hid. And so back in chapter 3 of Mark, in verse number 8, it says that there was a great multitude of people following him, and in that multitude, it specifically mentions that there were people from Tyre and Sidon. And so Jesus, the fame of Jesus had grown far beyond the borders of Israel, and the people from the Gentile nations of the north had heard about what they probably thought was just simply this miracle worker. They don't care if he's the Messiah. They don't care about if he's this Jewish God. But hey, I've heard some great things that this man has done. And man, I'd like to see that for myself. And so the people from Tyre and Sidon, they're coming down perhaps. No, we don't know. But perhaps maybe this woman was one of them. Perhaps she had been in the crowds. Maybe she has heard Jesus speak herself. Again, we're not told that. We don't know. But we do know that the people, at least some from this particular region of this Gentile nation of Phoenicia, they have heard of Jesus. They know who he is. And so even here, outside of Israel, Jesus simply cannot just hide away and get a time alone. And so this was these people, they know him, and listen, the people of Phoenicia are just like people anywhere else. If they need help, they're going to go to the place or the person where they think they can get that help. And so even though he was a Jew, and even though the Jews and the Gentiles didn't have the greatest of relationships, this woman had a problem, and she thinks this is the man who can help me and who can solve the issue. And so she goes and she finds him. Now, this was probably true for many people. I would assume that Jesus' trip through Phoenicia, through this Gentile area, he probably had a lot of run-ins with Gentiles seeking help. Again, his fame was spread. They know this, at least they know the name, and clearly the word had gotten out that he's there. And so I would imagine that there was a lot of different interactions that Jesus had, but the ones that we have written about are very few. And so this interaction that Jesus has with this woman that we read about here and in Matthew's account, which we'll look at a little bit later, it was something special about this particular account. Now, we never get her name. In this account or in Matthew's account, we never know this woman's actual name. Mark here refers to her simply as a Syrophoenician woman. Matthew, he calls her a woman of Canaan, which is an interesting title, but he calls her a woman of Canaan. Now, to understand this, as we've talked about a few times through the book of Mark, we understand that Mark was writing to a Roman audience. He was writing to people in Rome, a Roman audience, and a Syrophoenician would be a designation that they knew and understood well. They would understand exactly what he meant when he said a Syrophoenician woman. Now, she was a Syrophoenician for a couple of reasons. Number one, because she was from the country of Phoenicia, and then that country was later given to Syria under the Romans. And so they have the designation of Syrophoenicia. And so that is why he refers to her as such. Now, Matthew is not writing to a Roman Gentile audience. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. And so Matthew writes that this woman is a Canaanite, likely indicating her heritage. She comes from the people of Canaan. And so this would give the interaction a little bit more meaning, that Jesus is having this interaction not just with a Gentile, but a Gentile of Canaanite heritage. And so this woman, from these two designations, from Mark and Matthew, we see that this woman was everything that the Jewish people despised. Everything about her would have put her as low on the totem pole in the eyes of a Jew that one could possibly be. And so not only was she a woman, which obviously didn't elevate her to the status of any male would have in that particular culture, but she was a woman, she was a Gentile, she was a Greek. Mark references her being a Greek. She was a Canaanite. She was a Roman. All of these things are just putting her farther and farther and farther down the totem pole of people who the Jews would want anything to do with. Now, by being of Canaanite heritage and in the influence of the Greek and in the Roman culture, she had literally everything religiously going against her. She would have been, no doubt, we're not told this, but the assumption is that she would have been steeped in idol worship, steeped in pagan religion. That just makes sense considering where she's from, considering the titles that are given to her in the text. And it is likely, you think about it from that perspective, it is likely that when her daughter starts to have these demons, or at least a demon manifest in her, that she probably went through at least one or two or more pagan rituals and rites to try and get this demon out of her daughter, and of course they failed. They didn't do what she wanted they didn't do what she wanted them to do. And then she hears that Jesus is in town, and she knows this is the miracle worker. This is the man who everywhere he's gone, he has cast demons from people. That is what Jesus did everywhere he went, and he performed miracles. And they've heard of the feeding of the thousands, and they've seen, or rather heard of all these great and tremendous things that Jesus has done. And so she knows, if I want my daughter healed, I need to go to the healer. And that's why she comes to Jesus. And so instead of making a sacrifice to a false god, at least another sacrifice, instead of praying to some hollow and empty idol, she falls at the feet of the Savior who is going to help her daughter. Now, I want to talk about this just for a second. I'm not going to spend much time here. But again, in verse 25, for a certain woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit. Her young daughter had an unclean spirit. Now, obviously, we don't know how old her daughter was. The text doesn't tell us that. However, this word daughter here, this is the same exact Greek word that Jairus used when he referred to his daughter a few chapters back, and we know because the text tells us there that she was 12. And so we don't know how old this girl was, but the text uses that same word, and it specifically refers to her as young. And so we can assume, I think safely, that she was at the oldest 12. In my opinion, probably a little bit younger than 12. Now this girl has an unclean spirit, as the text refers to it, and that simply means she had a demon. She was possessed by a demon. This is an uncomfortable truth. Typically, when we think about demon possession, we don't typically think about it with regards to children. At least, I'm just speaking, from my own perspective here. When we think about demon possession, we typically think of it from an adult's perspective. Adults get demon possessed. Adults are are afflicted by this. We don't think of it as something that children deal with. But this is something that the Bible is pretty clear about, in fact. This girl has a demon. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of these Gospels tell, in fact we'll see it in Mark in a few chapters, tell of a demon-possessed boy who the dad tells Jesus had been possessed from the time that he was a young child. Again, we don't know how old that is, but we can imagine that's pretty young. And yet he had this demon. In fact, you go read that account, and it is very graphic, the way that this demon manifests and what he has this boy do. And so again, I don't like to talk about this because I don't like to think of the possibility of children being demon-possessed. But the fact is, it's a biblical truth. And so we see this, and immediately what it makes me think of is all these children that today are having all these issues and all these supposed mental, chemical imbalance issues. And I'm not here to negate all of that. I'm not here to say that none of that is real. That's not my point. But I think my point, what I'm trying to say is I think that probably more often than not, we're medicating an issue that doesn't need a medicinal answer. I think more often than not, we're trying to throw medicine at these kids because they're acting irrationally and they're acting in ways that just doesn't make sense to us. And perhaps there's a spiritual problem in that child and not a medical problem, and they don't need to be medicated. They need Christ. And that's the answer. And I think far too often we're doing our kids a disservice by simply just throwing drugs at them, hoping that solves some kind of a problem that we don't really know what it is. Because the Bible tells us, and it's very clear, this is an issue that doesn't just affect adults. Again, I understand this is uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. But I'm not going to just sit here and just drive right by this particular issue because it makes me uncomfortable. We need to be honest with this fact and understand that. And again, I'm not saying that anytime some child starts to act irrationally, that kid's demon-possessed. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is maybe our first inclination ought not to be, well, let's just see what drugs we can give them. Maybe we ought to take some time and assess the spiritual situation. And I think, more often than not, when we do that, I think we'll actually find the problem. Well, let me move on. All right, so verse 26, this woman was a Greek, she was a Syrophoenician. She besought him that she would cast forth the devil out of her daughter, but then Jesus responds. And in Jesus' response, looking from this at a 21st century perspective, we think, well, that is mighty harsh. Why would he say such a thing? This is incredibly rude. In fact, when you go back and you read Matthew's account, which we'll do here just in a second, when you read Matthew's account, it seems to make it even more rude and a little more harsh. And so Matthew responds, Jesus responds here, he says, let children first be filled, For it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it under the dogs. Well, what's he referring to there? I mean, he's referring to the Jews as the children and this woman as a dog. That's what he's calling her. In fact, go ahead and go back to Matthew chapter 15, because Matthew kind of fills in a little bit of things that Mark doesn't write about here. And so we'll see a couple of extra details in Matthew chapter 15. Matthew 15, start reading in verse number 22. Let's just read the whole thing. Go back to verse 21. Then Jesus went thence and departed into the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. But look at this, verse 23. But he answered her not a word. And so the very first time she comes, Jesus doesn't even respond. He almost ignores her totally. And so he answers her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. And so Jesus, this woman comes to Jesus. She's throwing herself before him. She's giving him the right titles. The Son of God, help me, the Son of David, oh Lord. And Jesus doesn't even say anything. And then the disciples are saying, just get her out of here. Well, we're trying to have this moment alone. Just send her away. In verse 24, he answered, and he said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, let me say this. He's saying this to his disciples. He's not saying this to her. And so, the first time she comes, she's totally ignored by Jesus. His disciples are complaining and saying, would you just get rid of her? The first time Jesus speaks, it's not even to her, it's to his disciples. And then it says, and then came she and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. So none of that deters this woman. She's persistent in her pursuit of Christ. She continues to come and she continues to cry out, help me, help me, help me. And finally Jesus responds to her, in which we read in the text, it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it the dogs. And so we see here again, as I said, looking at this from our perspective today, we say, well, my God, my goodness, this is incredibly harsh. Why would he respond in such a way? And then in Matthew's account, why would he not immediately respond, especially considering the circumstances? This is a child. She has a demon, and only you can help her. Jesus says nothing, and then when he does speak, refers to her as a dog. Now first, I want to see a couple of things here. First, we see that she came with the correct attitude. She came recognizing Jesus for who he was. Again, we saw this in Matthew's account, Lord, Son of David. These aren't Gentile titles. She's coming to this Jewish rabbi with Jewish titles. But again, Jesus doesn't answer her, not right away. Now, many reasons are given. A lot of different people have a lot of different opinions why Jesus did not immediately respond. And I read through a bunch of those this week, but I have to say, my opinion, I think, rightly aligns with MacArthur when he says this. He says, I think the reason that he didn't answer was to demonstrate to her and to everybody else what saving faith looks like. It is penitent, have mercy. It is reverent, Lord, Son of David. And it is persistent. It is relentless. I think, and I agree with what he's saying, I think he was giving his disciples a chance to see that not only was this message that Jesus was bringing to the Jews was eventually going to go to the Gentiles, which we'll see that here in just a second, but this is what saving faith looks like. See, she wasn't deterred. She had what in her sights, what she knew to be the Savior, and she was not going to relinquish that until she got what she desperately needed. Galilee had rejected him. However, this Greek, this Canaanite, this Syrophoenician woman understood him to be everything that he was. Furthermore, this was a chance to teach his disciples as they tried to send the woman away. As I said, Jesus doesn't respond, and I think that just gave way to the disciples, their complaint. Jesus, we're here trying to get a moment away from all of this. We've been doing ministry nonstop, day after day, week after week. We need a moment, and when we finally think we have it, here comes another problem our way. Jesus says, get her out of here. However, Jesus could use this moment to teach his disciples not only about ministry, but about compassion, about mercy, about grace, about salvation. As I said at the beginning, I do believe that this whole trip was revolved around teaching his disciples. And I think that's exactly what this moment became. He responds to them, not to her. He responds to them. I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is Jesus recognizing their complaints. I understand what you're saying. And that is my mission. I have been sent here to the lost sheep of Israel. This was the purpose of his coming, but this was not the end-all reason. The lost sheep of Israel would be the means by which the world was won. And this woman was to be kind of a first fruits, an example of what was to come. And so Jesus finally responds to the woman, and again, what might seem like an odd, perhaps even rude answer. He says, let the children first be filled. And again, he's talking about the Jews, the Gentile, or the Jews there, the disciples. Let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it under the dogs. So he uses a short parable, and it's easy to understand one. If you have your children sitting at the table and you have the dog under the table, you don't take the children's food and give it to the dog. You feed the children. The dog can simply, as the woman said later, the dog can just get whatever he gets. He eats the scraps off the floor. I can relate to this. Anytime we feed Ellie, Penny, our dog, literally will sit right under the high chair because she knows food's coming. It's gotten to the point now where Ellie will take a bite and give Penny a bite, and then she'll eat and give Penny a bite. And so I understand this concept, but we don't just take Ellie's food and just dump it right on the floor and say, here you go, Penny. No, you feed the children. The dogs get what the dogs get. In fact, this makes more sense when we understand that they did not have our perspective on dogs. People in our culture, generally speaking, love dogs. They're pets. We bring them into our homes. That was not the case. They were dirty. They were scavengers. They were very unclean. The Jews commonly referred to Gentiles as dogs, not as a way to lovingly say, hey, you're just like my companion. Oh, this was an insult, and it was a deep insult. You are dirty. You're unclean. And so he says, let the children first be filled. And so again, I think we get that. I don't need to really explain that more. His meaning is exactly what he told the disciples. He came to give the truth first to the Jews. The day for the Gentiles would come, and I'm glad for that. All of us in here, I believe, are very glad for that. However, it had not yet come. That was future still. And so Jesus uses this short parable. And so in order, basically is what he's saying is to do otherwise, to feed the dog first. That's a mixing of your priorities. My priority from Jesus' perspective, my priority was to come and to give the truth to the Jews. And then from the Jews, it would spread out to the world. And so his meaning is exactly what he told the disciples. He comes to give the truth to the Jews first. The truth was to come to them, and then the Gentiles. We understand this. We know this. This is exactly what we read, what Paul says in the book of Romans. Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of salvation, but it say unto the Jew first, and then the Greek, unto the Jew first, and also the Greek. This is exactly how it happened. The church started with who? The church started with Jews. It wasn't a group of Gentiles. It was a group of Jews who were the first church. And then from there, it spread out. We understand in Acts the tremendous vision of given to Peter of the sheet coming down with all the animals. And God saying, don't call unclean what I have made clean. It started with you, but it doesn't end with you. It goes out to the world. And again, all of us here today are beneficiaries of that statement. It has come out to us today, but it was given to them first. And that's why Jesus came. I give it to them first, and from them it spreads out. And listen, that was always supposed to be the case with Israel. Even in the Old Testament, that was always supposed to be the way that God's grace worked into the world. It's given to the Jews, and then it's kind of filtered out from them to the world. In Isaiah 49:6, it says, I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. Listen, the Jews were never supposed to despise the Gentiles. The Jews were supposed to reach the Gentiles by living for God. Obviously, that's not what it became. They came to despise them because they were unclean. Now, that's true. They were. But all of us are. And that's the point they missed. You see, they, in their minds, kind of set up a hierarchy. We're clean, they're not. And therefore, we're better. But what they didn't understand, or at least failed to see, is that the only reason they could have ever been considered clean is not because of anything that they did, it's because of what God did in and through them. And so it's the same thing today. This has not changed. We are unclean until God makes us clean. So now we need to understand this one more thing. The word dog, again, as I said earlier, this was a common insult. You can read through the Bible and you'll see it several times. This was a common insult for Jews to thrust upon the Gentiles. You're a dirty dog. And so this was, let's just be honest, this was a racist term. Jews, you're not us. We're going to refer to you as dogs. However, I do want to note this in verse 27. This is totally missed in the English. But it should be noted that the word that Jesus used for dog is not the normal word. The normal word would refer to this big, scavenger, nasty dog, this big brute of a beast. The word that Jesus used refers to essentially a puppy, a small, little dog. And so she's still a dog, but Jesus kind of lessened the sting of the word, because the purpose here was not to insult. The purpose here was to give truth. And so, yes, she's still a dog, but he kind of lessens the sting of the word a little bit. It's not, again, not to diminish the truth, but to diminish the insult being handed down that the Jews typically used. But this was Jesus' way of showing his priority again. Coming to the lost sheep of Israel. It was also an opportunity to show the ultimate aim of the gospel. It didn't end with the lost sheep of Israel. It began there, but it's certainly never supposed to end there. And so she comes back with this answer, and honestly her answer is perfect here. Verse 28. And she answered and said unto him, Yes, Lord, yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. She gets it. She understands exactly what he's saying, and she doesn't get offended. She doesn't walk away upset. She understands and accepts her position as dog and runs with the analogy. She shows tremendous humility, and honestly, she shows a good grasp of theology. She could have been offended. She certainly could have been. I think a lot would have been. She could have walked away. She could have been angry. However, she responds with no pushback on the term dog. In fact, seemingly, she accepts it as appropriate. She takes Jesus' parable and she says, yeah, but sometimes the dogs get the crumbs when they fall off the table. She is essentially saying, I know I'm not a Jew. I understand that. I know that I'm a Gentile. I'm dirty. I am a dog. But even the dogs can eat the scraps that fall from the table. Then can't I be blessed from what that spills over from Israel? The glory, the grace, the truth, the miracles, all the things that you're doing down there in Israel. Can I get a crumb? So in her response, she humbly accepts her position as dog. She admits she is unclean. She admits that she is unworthy of the potential blessings of Christ. I know it's not for me, but can I get a crumb? In so doing, as I said, her theology was better than every Pharisee that Jesus had ever encountered. They thought themselves too good to need the message that Jesus came to bring. This woman knew that she was not good enough, and she was simply asking for a crumb. So her theology, as funny as it sounds, was better than the religious elite of Israel. And we understand that, as has happened with all of these miracles that we have read throughout the book of Mark, they happen because of faith. When Jesus heals, when Jesus does something miraculous for an individual, it has been in response to faith. We've seen that several times, and that's exactly what happens here, verse 29. And he said unto her, For this saying, Go thy way, the devil is gone out of thy daughter. It was the faith of this Gentile, Greek, Canaanite, Syrophoenician woman, and who was at this point the Jewish Messiah that led to the freeing of her daughter from their demon. It was her faith in this Jewish Messiah when she was this dirty Gentile that led to her daughter getting the freedom that she needed. Matthew makes this point even clearer as Jesus begins his response to her by saying this. We don't get this in Mark, but in Matthew 15 it says this, O woman, great is thy faith. And then Jesus responds. Wiersbe, he said, it must have rejoiced his heart when she took his very words and used them as a basis for her plea. She accepted her place, she believed his word, and she persisted in her plea. And Jesus not only met her need, but commended her for her faith. Now, I do think it's interesting, and it should be pointed out, Jesus traveled all over the region. He traveled all over Israel, and as we see, he ventured at times into the Gentile area. He spoke in countless synagogues. He had countless interactions with countless individuals. He had many encounters with the top of the religious ladder, and through none of these do we ever read of him commenting on the great faith of an Israelite. Not one time. Not one time in all the Gospels does Jesus ever say anything about the great faith of an Israelite. Only 2 times in the Gospels does Jesus make a statement like that. Once it was here, and once it was to the centurion. Only twice in all the Gospels does Jesus comment on faith, and not once was it to a Jewish person. In conclusion, the text tells us there in verse number 20, or rather verse number 30, and when she was come to her house, she found the devil gone out, and her daughter laid upon the bed. And so when she gets home, she sees her daughter completely freed of this demon lying upon the bed. Her faith was rewarded. Now, again, I want to note that this is at least the first time in Mark that we see Jesus perform a miracle from a distance. And from that I mean something performed for an individual. He was not physically present where the actual miracle took place. So this is the first time we see this in Mark's gospel. From that we understand and we know, but we see that Jesus' power has no limitations in either scope or space. In scope, we've seen this. He's fed the thousands. He's stopped the storms upon the sea. There's no end to the scope of his power, but from this we see there's no end to the space in which he has to be. He doesn't have to be there in person. He could have calmed the sea from the other hemisphere if he wanted to. There's no limitations upon the power of Christ. Now, we know that God is omnipresent. Again, we understand that. He is everywhere at once. However, Jesus, limiting his divinity in his physical presence to something that is not omnipresent. So he was not omnipresent, but his power most certainly was. There was nothing too big, there was nothing too far away for his power to conquer. And so again, this is not the only time this will happen, but we see this is the first time where Jesus simply says, you can go home now. It has been done. Lastly, and I'll end with this, in this miracle, we see the way in which the gospel was given and the gospel was spread. As we saw earlier, we talked about it earlier, it was to the Jew first. We read in Romans chapter 9, it says, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises. All of these have been given to them, to the Israelites. It says, whose are the fathers and of whom concerning the flesh Christ came. So not only did they get all the blessings, they got all the promises, they got the scriptures, they got the truth, but not only that, but they got Christ in the flesh coming to them. But then it goes on to say, who is over all. As I said earlier, it was to them first, but it was never to end there. It was to them first to be spread to us today. To use the parable of Jesus, the meal was given to Israel, but the Gentiles enjoy the crumbs that have overflowed from that particular meal. Listen, we are no different than this woman. Don't think ourselves above this woman. We are this woman. We are a dog eating of the crumbs falling from the table. That's what has happened. That's who we are. But praise be to God, because in His mercy and in His grace, He keeps the crumbs falling. And we as dogs just sit there and just get to lap it up. But we're the dog in the story. We're the ones that are unclean. We're the ones that cannot do anything about it other than to accept the free gift of grace that only God can offer. And so we will continue to take the crumbs that He continues to give, and blessed be to Him, because as all the glory goes to Him, but those crumbs are our salvation. They are our eternity with Him, the crumbs that we could not fashion ourselves, but He came to gloriously give us. Let's pray.